Well, we've all met the characters before in today's Bible story. Even if this was the first time that you heard this story, you know them. The rich man and Lazarus. Now notice, first of all, the rich man in the story doesn't even have a name. Jesus gave the poor man, Lazarus, a name, but the rich man doesn't have one. So over the centuries, the church has given the rich man a name because wealthy people always have names. It's the poor people who are anonymous. So we gave him the name Dives, D-I-V-E-S, and it comes from the old Latin Bible's word for wealthy. And I'm sure Dives felt like he deserved what he had. He'd worked hard. He'd earned it. Dives lives in a secure building with a doorman. It makes him feel safe, and he likes to go out to eat when and where he wants. He likes to go to his favorite restaurant and know that the waiters are going to know his name, and the bartender will know his favorite drink. Feels good to slip on that linen shirt in the morning and then put on that purple suit and slip behind the wheel of his large automobile and pull up to the valet. He's earned it. You know that guy. I know that guy. I also know Lazarus. I pass Lazarus several times a day after I've slipped on my linen shirt. I don't have a purple suit, but I do walk out every morning past a doorman into the streets of the Loop. Can you spare some change? Can you help me get something to eat? Streetwise. Or sometimes Lazarus is just passed out against a wall with a 7-Eleven cup in front of him and a cardboard sign propped up against his chest. People walk past Lazarus. They're careful not to make eye contact because who knows what would happen if you did that. Nobody wants to see Lazarus. Nobody wants to be Lazarus. But Dives, the rich man, everybody notices him. I don't like this story very much. I wish it weren't in the Bible. It hits too close to home. And the thing is, if you look at it in its context, Jesus isn't telling this story to particularly wealthy people. He's not talking to the 1%. He's telling this story to good, average, upstanding, moral people, but people whose hearts tend to lean more towards style and money than they lean towards Lazarus. The story also isn't original to Jesus. This was a common sort of folk tale that was circulating at the time. And the way that the story usually ended was that somebody did come back from the dead and warn people on earth of a horrible fate that was waiting them and they would change, sort of like Jacob Marley coming back to visit Ebenezer Scrooge. But Jesus changes all of that up. He doesn't give the story that ending that we want. There's no good Samaritan. Nobody comes back from beyond the grave to warn the living. The gate that has kept Lazarus out stays up, and it just becomes this huge, gaping, eternal chasm that keeps the rich man from experiencing the salvation that Lazarus receives. So what do you think of this description of the world to come? Does Dives deserve what he gets? What do you think of Abraham's reasoning? You were comfortable in life, Lazarus suffered. Now Lazarus is comfortable, and you're suffering. I used to giggle at this story when I was a boy because it had the word bosom in it. So what the heck is Abraham's bosom? Well, in the ancient world, when you had a feast, when you dined, you would lay on couches, and a table was in front of you, and so you'd lean on your left side and you'd eat with your right hand. Now, if you were the host and you had a guest of honor, that person would sit right next to you, so they'd be in your bosom. That's what it is. That's what Abraham's bosom is. Lazarus is the honored guest at the meal. He's getting the care and the comfort and the recognition that he never received in life. In Abraham's bosom, people know his name. He's a somebody. The rich man says, Father Abraham, could you just send Lazarus to go warn my family about what's going to happen to them? No, I'm sorry, I can't do that. But they do have Moses and the prophets. They should just listen to them. Now, if Dives had been paying attention to his Bible, he would have heard Moses say something like this to him. You shall open your hand to your brother and sister, to the needy, to the poor, and to the strangers living among you. Now, I don't think Jesus retold this common folk tale in order to give us a doctrine of what the afterlife is going to look like. There's a common folk tale. He used this tale to point our attention not to the next world, but to this world. He's turning our attention to the Lazarus who's at our gate, because somehow our salvation is connected with his. Our salvation is connected with Lazarus. In 1985, Lincoln Park was rapidly gentrifying, and young professionals were moving into this neighborhood and were coming to St. Paul's. The church was growing, but at the same time, the homeless population in Lincoln Park was ballooning. The Chicago Coalition for the Homeless estimated back then that there were 25,000 homeless people in Chicago. You know how many they estimate today? 125,000. So in '85, the young professionals coming to St. Paul's were having to step over Lazarus, who was sleeping in their doorways. And they could have kept on walking, they could have ignored him, but they didn't. They listened to Moses, they listened to Jesus. And the folks who were around here back then when St. Paul's helped to found the Lincoln Park Community Shelter say that it wasn't because of a strategic plan that they did this or that they had some miraculous vision from God. It was just that the call was right in front of them. Human beings worthy of dignity and respect were sleeping right on their doorsteps. They were sleeping in the alleys in the church courtyard. And we had more than enough. We had a kitchen, we had a gym, showers, laundry, and we opened the gate and we said, "Come in." Now, I started at St. Paul's 15 years ago when we were still the primary site for the Lincoln Park Shelter. And I remember the daily rhythm back then. Every day, if you stayed late after the office closed and the nursery school kids had gone home, the shelter guests would arrive every night and they'd go into the Oscar Mayer room. And then a volunteer crew would come in and set up in the kitchen, and I could smell supper cooking wafting up the stairway into my office. And if you stayed really late, I particularly remember on Christmas Eve, after the guests had gone to bed, you could feel the quiet presence of their lives inhabiting this church all through the night. Now, that wasn't an ideal situation because every morning the guests had to roll up their mats and clear the space for the daily program. So it was a good thing when 10 years ago the shelter was able to carve out a permanent home in the basement of Lincoln Park Presbyterian. But you know what? After the shelter moved out, you could feel this emptiness that it left. It's like when a loved one moves away from your home, you feel their absence. The smell of supper was gone every evening, and the presence of those souls sleeping in our church every night was gone, and it felt like some of our heart was gone from St. Paul's. Now, I'm thrilled that we now have the community engagement program every Sunday, and some of that shelter soul has come back and is with us every week. But I wonder, who is Lazarus for us today? Who do we as a church need to notice, invite inside, pay attention to, join our lives with, find salvation with? A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to Deborah Rose. She's one of our newer members who is a retired UCC pastor. And we learned that we had both studied French literature in college. And she reminded me of the play by the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, Huis Clos, No Exit. Have you seen that? Or read it? So, No Exit takes place in hell, just like Jesus' story. But in No Exit, hell is this small locked room, and there's a light bulb that's on all the time. And 3 strangers are put into this room, and they have to spend a sleepless eternity together. So, of course, before long, they drive each other absolutely crazy. And at the end, one of the characters says, "Hell is other people." I think there's some truth to that. Hell is other people. But you know what? For Christians, heaven is other people. Salvation is found with other people. When God saves Israel, God saves them as a people. When Jesus saves us, he calls us to be the church. Now, I want to say a word about that salvation. Now, for some of you, that might feel uncomfortable. You've heard fundamentalists use that word. But salvation isn't narrowly defined. It's a broad word. And in its essence, it just means 2 things: to be safe and to be healed. To be safe and to be healed. And that is something every one of us needs. But our salvation, our healing, is found with other people, and especially those who are hurting. In some strange and mysterious disguise, Christ is Lazarus, overlooked, wounded, covered with sores. And that's the paradox of our faith, the paradox of the cross. The place we meet God is in the place of weakness and pain, both in ourselves and in others. When I was in junior high school, we lived in Boise, Idaho. And it was the first place that I ever heard anything about homelessness. Now, we were evangelical Christians, so for us, salvation meant saving individual souls from hell. But we'd also listen to Moses and to Jesus and what they said about the poor. So our church supported a homeless shelter in downtown Boise, and it was called a rescue mission. Now, when you're a preacher's kid like I was, you get to have a lot of experiences that your peers miss out on. And once a month, we had to go to the rescue mission. Now, that mission didn't turn anybody away. You could show up drunk, you could show up high, you could show up however, and you were welcome there. You'd have a place. But because we were evangelicals, you could only get your supper if you went into the chapel and sat through an evangelistic service first. So once a month, Dad was in charge of this service, and I had to go with him and play the piano for the hymns. Well, by the time we'd arrive, Lazarus would already be filling the pews. And the place would smell of body odor, and there'd be strange noises. And I was a little bit frightened because of their open door policy. Some strange things would always happen every time we go. We'd have an opening hymn, and Dad would read a scripture, and then he'd preach the gospel. And at the end, he would invite anyone who wanted to get saved by Jesus that night to raise their hand. And every time we went to the rescue mission, people raised their hands. People who've hit bottom, people whose wounds are clearly visible to the world, they seem to be more acutely aware of their need to be saved than people who wear linen shirts and have a doorman. The Quaker writer Parker Palmer said, "I used to think that God was up. Now I know that God is down." Down. That's where God saves us. You know, I still have an evangelical heart. I believe that salvation is deeply personal, but I also believe that we can only find salvation together as a community that includes both Dives and Lazarus. I don't know what eternity will be like, but I know that we have a crucified and a risen Lord, which means that Christ is risen. Salvation is today. Christ meets us, our neighbors. Christ meets Lazarus today. Well, after Dad would give the invitation for salvation, we'd always ask if anybody in the congregation had a favorite hymn that they'd like to sing before we went to supper. And it never failed. Every time we were at the rescue mission, when he asked that question, someone would call out, "In the garden! I come to the garden alone, while the dew is still on the roses, and the voice I hear falling on my ear, the Son of God discloses." If you know the chorus, sing it with me. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. And the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. That was the favorite hymn of Lazarus. That was the favorite hymn of the down and out, the nameless and the ignored. In the years since, I've pondered the significance of that. And that hymn is in the voice of someone who's waking up all alone in a garden, in a city park. There's still dew on the ground. But the singer realizes that he's not alone. Out on the street, nobody pays any attention to him. Nobody sees him. People walk right past. But alone in the garden, with Christ by his side, Christ says to him, "I'm with you. I know your name. You are my very own." Amen.